Good morning. So what we were talking about last time was measures of material living standards in the world before 1800. And so we went through first the best measures, which are complete measures of wages per day, which take account of all the goods that people consume. And then we said, well, we can't get that for many societies, so the next thing we can look at are wages measured in terms of how much wheat it can buy you. Okay? And that's a very partial measure, and it's going to be misleading in some cases because the price of food relative to other goods, or food relative to clothing, or housing, or fuel is actually going to vary across societies. Now we want to think about, well, how do these living standards around the world in 1800 compare to the original hunter-gatherers? And of course, in hunter-gatherer society, there is no wage. And so the first way we can try and do this comparison is, first of all, just by looking at how much people get to eat. And so there's an association in modern societies between income level and food consumption. Right? And in our society, we actually typically have the problem that we consume too much food. Right? But richer people typically consume more calories, though that association is not particularly strong in our society. But if you go to very poor societies, there's going to be a strong association between income and the number of calories per day that you consume. Okay? And so what we can then do is, around about 1800, for both England and Belgium, we can actually estimate how many calories per day the median person in those societies consumes. And you'll see that in England and Belgium, it's not that different. It's about 2,300, 2,200, right? Now, that's just the median. There will be poor people who will consume less, and there'll be rich people who consume more. But this is what the median, the average person in that society is consuming. And we actually get some evidence for later in England in the 1860s, where this was one of the first systematic surveys of nutrition that was done. And there's a strong correlation within England in that period between, at a county level, what the wage level is and how many calories people consume, right? So that's why we think of calories. It's going to be some measure of people's real income levels, okay? And particularly for poor people in this pre-industrial world. Now, what we can then do is anthropologists have spent a lot of time studying in detail the few surviving groups of hunter-gatherers who remain in the world to the present. And one of the things that they've done is actually sit there all day with a diary and take a note of exactly how much food people are consuming in these societies. And often they're interested in who's consuming the food and what type of food is being consumed. And so the book actually reports there's a collection of these surveys which actually include for hunter-gatherer societies and also for forager societies. And so it's shifting cultivation societies as well. That is, groups that don't engage in settled agriculture but have gardens in the forest, and then they periodically move on, establish a new site. And so for a whole collection of these early groups, we can actually get these modern estimates of what is average food consumption within these groups. And it turns out that there's a range of variation. Right? Some of that is just going to be caused by error, or it's be caused by a fact that the anthropologists were observing in a good period. And these societies go through the good season, the bad season, there's random shocks, there's a lot of game in some times, there's not a lot in other times. But if we take the median of these observations, it's actually remarkably similar to England around about 1800. There's no sign that the English are so wealthy that they're getting to consume much more food measured in terms of calories. Okay? And as I say, there's this big variation where the Achi here, in the time they were observed, were living very well, and the Yanomamo were living very poorly. But it is remarkable that there's no sign of any difference. And remember, when we looked across the world in 1800, England is amongst the richest of the settled agrarian societies in the world in that period. Places like Japan and China are going to be systematically poorer. And so the implication of this kind of study would be that most settled agrarian societies in the world in 1800, most of the people living in the world in 1800 were living at worse levels of nutrition than amongst hunter-gatherers, right? Now, as I say, calories are a very imperfect measure because that's the one thing the body will try and conserve as you get poorer and poorer, right? You need energy to work and to live. And so what happens as people get poorer and poorer, they switch to foods that are more and more intensive in calories and that have a better and better payoff per dollar in terms of how many calories you can get. Okay? And so that's why it's a very blunt measure of living standards, because our calorie consumption would not be that much higher than hunter-gatherers, but our real food consumption is much greater than a lot of poor societies because we eat sushi and fine prepared foods and all kinds of variety, and that's what happens as people get richer. But at least it's one partial measure, and it really does suggest that there hasn't been much improvement. In fact, there's no sign of any improvement at all. Now, one thing here is that this measure, if anything, is actually going to be biased in favor of settled agrarian societies. That it's going to overestimate what their real food consumption is compared to hunter-gatherers. And the reason for that is that we saw that somewhere like England in 1800, average work hours per day are about 9. Okay? A lot of work still in this society is still by manual labor. So if you take an agricultural worker in this period, they would spend about a quarter of the year by hand threshing grain. And that really just consists of being in a barn for 10 hours a day, hitting the grain with a stick and trying to shake loose the wheat or the barley or the oats. It's incredibly monotonous, and it's very hard work. Another large chunk of the year would be spent digging out ditches. There's also all the manure has to be gathered and hauled out onto the fields. They have to cut the fences to get the firewood from the fences. There's a lot of heavy labor involved in this society. And what's interesting is that the more hours of labor you engage in, the greater your calorie consumption goes up. Right? So calorie consumption is very dependent on the amount of work effort that you're actually putting in. And I think I mentioned already that survey in the 1860s found that in some of the very high-wage, highly productive agricultural areas in Britain, male farm workers could consume as many as 5,000 calories a day. Right? Because if you're doing a lot of work, then you need a lot of this fuel. And since hunter-gatherers systematically don't spend most of the time sitting around, right? They're only actually engaged in activity for something like 6 hours a day compared to 9 hours a day here. If anything, this will kind of overestimate how good the food consumption is in these settled societies because there are these much greater labor inputs that are being put in. And so it's the first kind of startling finding is that really there's no difference between these hunter-gatherers and settled agrarian societies. Now, one thing we do have to worry about is there are very few groups of hunter-gatherers left in the world at present. There is, for example, off the coast of India, there's a group of islands which has a surviving group of hunter-gatherers that no one has made contact with yet. And the reason no one's made contact with them is that they're very fierce, and they kill anyone who comes near them. And so when people get shipwrecked on these islands, typically they're going to be killed by the inhabitants. And so there's this interesting group that's living out there that can see airplanes flying overhead, but has no idea what is happening in the rest of the world, but they know they don't like it. And so they've remained uncontacted. And as I say, if things continue at present for the rest of history, they could remain as a completely isolated hunter-gatherer group. And so there is some worry that the surviving groups of hunter-gatherers may be, in some sense, different from the average hunter-gatherer that was existing in the world in prehistory, right? Because why haven't they come out of the forest and said, hold on, there's a lot of stuff happening here, we need to latch on to this. It's unclear what keeps these groups as remnant groups. And there is one group in Brazil which has continued a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, where there's been some interesting studies about their language and about their numeracy. And one of the debates actually has been, is this just that this group is actually mentally subnormal? That there's actually, that they have some deficiency, because it turns out that this is a group of people who apparently don't have the concept of number. And there's, as I say, amongst linguists, there's been this debate raging. Is it really the case that there's a group of people in the world who don't have numbers? Right? And a lot of hunter-gatherer societies have simple number systems, so they have 1, 2, 3, and then many. Okay? Interestingly, the ancient Greeks had a number system that wasn't that much more elaborate than that. But this group, the claim of the anthropologists who studied them is that they actually don't have the concept of number completely, right? That they completely miss the idea of counting. Now, they're successful hunters, right? And they hunt and then they trade with Brazilian traders. Another interesting thing is that no one in the group has ever learned Portuguese. Right? They have their own language, but they've never, even though they trade all the time with the Brazilian traders, no one's actually managed to learn Portuguese within this group. And this anthropologist spent a year trying to teach members of this group how to count, and in the end was unsuccessful. Could not convey that concept. And so it does raise then some issues about, well, is there something about the culture or some other aspect of these societies that have remained hunter-gatherers to the current time that says that they're not going to be typical of the average hunter-gatherer, that there's something different about these groups? That's something we just can't control for, right? It's the best we get in terms of what are these remaining groups. We just have to hope that it's something to do with climate and geography or something else that kept these groups as hunter-gatherers, and that's why they've remained as hunter-gatherers. They're just typical of hunter-gatherers, and that consequently it's actually giving us insight into what the hunter-gatherer lifestyle would be. And so that's the first thing then, is that calorie consumption is just as high as a median, right? Now, as I say, that's the median. Within England in this period, poor people are consuming much less, and then there were rich people who are living very, very well. And one difference may be that in hunter-gatherer society, food consumption is more egalitarian between the poor and the wealthy than in somewhere like England, where a very small fraction of the society gets about half of all the income in the society. And so that it may well be that there's much greater inequality in somewhere like Britain than there is in hunter-gatherer society. Okay? But what that would actually imply then is that the average person in Britain, the median, this is the average calorie consumption per day in the society, that if you took the average person, they actually might have even lower calorie consumption than these numbers that are given here. If there's a group at the top that are really consuming enormous numbers of calories. Okay? And in line with that, it turns out that we, as I say, because of the marvelous preservation of records in pre-industrial England, we have the food consumption record of the monks of Westminster Abbey all the way back to the Middle Ages. So we know exactly how many monks there were, what they consumed each day, all the way through back until the 14th century, I believe. And it turns out that the monks of Westminster Abbey were consuming something like 5,000 calories a day per head. Westminster Abbey was the richest monastery in England because it was where the king was close by Westminster Palace, and so it was very well endowed. It turns out that the monks were actually quite ingenious because they were Benedictines, and the rule of St. Benedict prescribed that there had to be fast days on various days of the year. But rich people don't like to fast very much, and so the monks actually studied the rule carefully and realized that the rules called for the monks dining in the refectory to be fasting, and they said, well, it's just if you're dining in the refectory, so they built a second dining room where on fast days they could repair to and actually eat what they wanted, because then they were still meeting the technical terms of the rule. And I think in some of the other Benedictine monasteries, they had a rota about who had to go and eat and fast that day. but the bulk of the monks could actually escape this. And so they actually have this incredibly high calorie consumption, though it turns out that a lot of that seems to have not directly been consumed by the monks, because there were a class of pensioners who had the right to get the leftovers from the monks' tables. And so after they finished dining, this other group of people actually appeared and then ate large amounts of what was left over. And so, as I say, we have this feature that median consumption is, amongst these hunter-gatherer groups, is just as good as in England. There's going to be a lot of inequality in consumption in England. And so it may well be that the average person, even in England, is consuming less in terms of calories than the average hunter-gatherer, in a society where likely the average person is doing more labor than the average hunter-gatherer. That just looks at calories. In terms of the quality of food consumption, if anything, we think hunter-gatherers did better, because the English diet for the average person, even by 1800, is very monotonous. The chief item in the diet is bread. And so agricultural laborers, for example, poorer workers in society, that's the bulk of their consumption, is just bread, bread, and bread. They get a little bit of meat, by this time a little bit of tea, but it's very plain, it's a very bland diet. Hunter-gatherers, in contrast, actually get a very varied and very elaborate diet, right? And the only trouble with their diet is it's completely random, right? You have very little idea what you're going to be eating any day, but they get a lot of protein, a lot of meat, and actually a lot of variety in their diet, in contrast to the English, who actually had this very monotonous diet. And that shows up in terms of how much protein people got to consume. So for England, farm workers, their diet, we think, supplied about 28 grams of protein per day. And for the average person, you got about 48 grams of protein per day. So protein is what you need to maintain muscle strength, and protein demands are relatively independent of how much work you need to do, right? And so if you work a lot more, it doesn't necessarily increase protein demands, but that's what you need in order to maintain body structure. Yeah.
So what does it say in England?
So England, so this is farm workers get 28 grams, and then the average person in England got about 48 grams. So farm workers are a relatively poor group within the society. And protein consumption responds much more to income than does calorie consumption. Because as people get richer, one of the things that they do is they move towards foods that contain much more protein. They move towards meat and fish and dairy products. And so proteins are actually a better indicator of the true living standards of people than are calories. Okay? How does the median hunter-gatherer group do? They get about 63 grams per day. And so in terms of the stuff that people cared about in the diet later, hunter-gatherers are actually doing very well. They have this high-protein diet compared to the diets of the English in that period. Okay? And so, as I say, it's a kind of astonishing feature of the world that despite the sophistication of societies like England or China or Japan around about 1800, hunter-gatherers' food consumption is actually easily just as good. And in fact, the evidence seems to be maybe somewhat better than the average settled society in this period. Now, how else can we compare living standards if we want to go to the distant past? And here, the next thing that we can actually look at is human heights. Because richer people consume more food, and also higher quality food in terms of more proteins, there's a strong association between the income level of a society and the average heights of people within that society. And if any of you have traveled around the world, you'll notice that immediately if you go to a very poor society. So I'm not particularly tall, but I've been to India. I spent some time traveling around India in the late 90s. And it's immediately apparent that, suddenly you're a giant amongst the people in that society. And similarly, even students coming to University of California, Davis, I would say that immigrants from poorer societies tend to be smaller than students who've grown up in the United States. And so you really see that, it's the visible record of the living standards of the society are how tall are the people within that society. And so there's been a huge enterprise to kind of use these measures as a proxy for income. Because the nice thing about these records is that you don't depend on the society having records, having literacy, having prices, or anything like that to use these measures. And one huge repository for these measures from the past is skeletons. We have large collections of skeletons from various societies in the past, and so that consequently we can get some insight just by the dimensions of people into how rich were these societies or how poor were they. Okay? Now, this measure using heights is a little bit tricky because it's going to depend on the idea that genetically there aren't differences between human societies in terms of what the genetic potential for height is. And the people who favor these measures claim that that turns out to be a constant of almost all human societies, is that we all have the same height potential. There are only very few groups like the Pygmies who actually have any genetic difference in terms of what their likely potential height is going to be. The problem is that that's not entirely clear. Because what we can do now is, in the modern world, we get very good income measures. And then we have very good height measures across various societies. And so do people know who the tallest people in the world are? It's kind of surprising but interesting fact. It's the Dutch. America is actually up there relatively close. But the Dutch actually, and that's a society where income levels are very close to those in the United States. And so we actually get this ranking of societies that we could do just in terms of how tall are people. And it turns out to correlate very well with income. And so that's the idea here. But there are some societies that are outliers in this association, and one of them is Japan. Japan is at an income level that's very close to that of the United States and the Netherlands, but it's still the case that the Japanese are significantly shorter than Americans. And so it does raise this worry that there may be some difference, though the claim, I believe, is that this is likely due to differences in diet still between different societies. That diet still has some influence, and that there are systematic differences between Asian diets still and United States diets, and that's going to make some difference in terms of this impact, right? But what that actually suggests is we should be careful in using these measures of, well, let's look at the Japanese now compared to the Japanese in the past, right? And just control for the group. So the best measure would be one which looks at a group in 1800 compared to the same group of people genetically 1,000 years earlier or 2,000 years earlier. Okay? So the other worry about, or the other thing that height measures actually incorporate are information about the disease environment of the society. So the final height of people is a product both of the amount of nutrition that you get, the quality of that nutrition, but it's also a product of the amount of disease that people are exposed to as they're growing up. Because if children get sick at various stages, they're only able partially to catch up on the growth that they're missing, right? Sickness can cause growth to cease, and then consequently, in later years, you don't completely catch up. And so height actually are both measures of kind of the health of a society and also of the food consumption within these societies. And what does this record suggest? Now, to just calibrate things here, the modern American male is on average about 70 inches tall. And that is, everything is done in the book here in terms of centimeters because the rest of the world has actually switched sensibly to a metric system. And so that's 178 centimeters. Okay? And just again, we can calibrate as I'm 67 inches tall. Actually, I'm genetically taller than I look because actually I was a very sickly child, and so I probably lost several inches as a result of that. Just think about that in terms of these height measures that we have for various groups. So what's the record for England around about 1800? And we get a variety of measures of heights in England, and it comes out to between 166 and 171 centimeters as male heights. Okay? And that's between 65 and 67 inches. Right? And so the average man in England around about 1800 is about an inch shorter than I am. Okay? And so you can see that that's a significant difference between heights then, and it's about 4 inches gap between heights then and heights now. Okay? Now, another thing in terms of these height measures you have to worry about is that people's height actually varies over the course of their lives. Men don't achieve final height, and in societies where nutrition is poor, men actually continue growing into their 20s, right? Their final height is actually achieved later in societies where nutrition is poor, but then you start to shrink as you get older. And so these various studies that I'm reporting, whatever possible, you try and standardize for heights of men between 20 and 40, okay? So that's heights. Now, how do we get information on heights in this, and why is there so much information on heights? And so these are heights of the living. The reason is that heights were used for identification purposes. So a bunch of these people that we get measures for from England are, first of all, it was the convicts who were sent to Australia, right? Now, there's a problem with that, which is, again, that in the pre-industrial world, height was a product of your social class. Poor people were short, rich people were tall in this early world, right? We've now moved to somewhere like America where the gradient of height with income is very, very limited, right? We're all so well-nourished that it doesn't matter that much anymore. But in the pre-industrial world, there was actually a much stronger gradient between the heights of people and their income level. And so one problem with these height measures for England is that partly we're measuring convicts here. Convicts tend to be poorer. Another problem you actually run into with these early height measures in Britain is that rural people were taller than urban people. When people moved to cities, even though they were richer in cities, the disease environment was so much more adverse that they ended up being relatively much shorter. So amongst the shortest groups ever measured in the world are a bunch of London orphans who were recruited into the Marine Society, and they show up as having one of the shortest heights for their age that's been observed anywhere, right? So there are all these complications that appear with heights, which is that it's dependent on income in this early society. It's also dependent on urban versus rural location. And so that's why we're reporting a variety of measures here. And so we have the convicts sent to Australia after American independence. They had to find somewhere else to send them. A second group of measures we have here are indentured servants who were recruited from England to go to the United States. And again, these tend to be relatively lower class individuals that we're reporting on. And again, they're measured in order that they have ways of identifying people if they run away. Right? And so that you have, and so some of these things come from how do we keep track of people. And then the third group of measures we have are measures from the Army or the Navy. And so for purposes of fitness, armies would set minimum height limits, and so they would measure soldiers coming into the Army. And again, we can look at that distribution. We've got to worry that there's a truncation at the lower end, but you can still infer what's the average height of people joining the Army. Okay? And so that's why, as I say, we get this variety of measures, and we think that we're getting reasonably close to what the average person's height in British society was in this period. Now, first of all, let's think. So these are measures around 1800. How does that compare? Remember, England seems to be a relatively wealthy society in this period. How does that compare to other societies? And so the most dramatic contrast is actually with Japan in this period. And unfortunately for Japan, the first measure we get is actually for the 1880s. Okay? But the reason that we think that's actually going to be a reasonable measure for 1800, is that on the reading list for Chapter 3 is a paper that estimates living standards in Japan from 1700 through the 19th century, and you'll see it's just flat in Japan in this period. That by the 1880s, Japan has just opened up to the outside world. All the evidence is that living standards in the 1880s are not that different from living standards in 1800. And so we think that this should be a relatively good measure of heights in Japan in that period. And this is for soldiers who were recruited into the Japanese army in this period. And the average height of these soldiers is only 159 centimeters. And in terms of inches, that's 62 and a half inches. So the average Japanese male at this stage is about 8 inches shorter than the average American male now. And that's one of the shortest measurements we get of heights in the world for, at any time for any group. And so you see that the height evidence here, at least on its face, is seeming to confirm this idea that Asia is poor in the onset of the modern period, and compared to England, right? That Asia is actually a relatively poor society. But as I say, there is this worry that modern Japanese males are still several inches shorter than the average American male in this time. And so the best way of looking at this measure is, well, how much did heights gain in England in this period? And so in England, from 1800 till now, there's been a gain of about 4 inches. In Japan, from 1800 to now, there's been a gain of more than 5.5 inches, right? And so there's been more height gain as Japan entered the modern world than there was in England. And so it really seems that Japan really is a relatively very poor pre-industrial society. What other places can we get evidence of? We get evidence of South China. And this is for people born between 1800 and 1829. And their average height is 164 centimeters. So again, it falls below the range of English heights, around about 1800. How do we know the heights of people in South China in this period? It turns out these were Chinese men who emigrated to Australia in the mid-19th century in the gold rush to work as laborers in the gold fields, and who subsequently committed crimes and were arrested in Australia and were measured. So all of this data actually comes from Australia in the later period, but their ages and their heights are given, and so you can actually look at this group who was born earlier in China in this period and say, well, what are their average heights now? And again, there's this problem of selectivity. Who would actually move to Australia in this period? Clearly, it's not going to be the richer people in Chinese society. On the other hand, there's a selection. I mean, the people who tend to migrate tend to be more healthy, more aggressive. There is a tendency for migrants to be the more active people in any society. And so we actually, and we think some of these English measures are actually coming from English convicts sent to Australia, right? Or English indentured servants who are shipped to the United States in the 18th century. And so these are actually relatively comparable measures, it would seem. And again, it's confirming this idea that living standards are probably lower in China around about this period than they are in Europe. And then the third group that we get is we get nice evidence for India. And this is, again, for people born about 1800 to 1820. And heights here are 161 to 163 centimeters. Who are these people? What happened was that under the British Empire, Britain had taken over places like East Africa, Fiji, and it turns out that it was very hard for them to recruit local African laborers. The Africans were not interested in wage labor. They lived there's lots of land in these societies, and so they needed labor to run plantations, to build railroads in various parts of the British Empire. And so these people were recruited again as indentured servants who were then shipped out to work in these other parts of the British Empire. And again, there's this issue, well, who's going to be an indentured servant? It's likely to be someone at the lower end of the income distribution. On the other hand, when you're recruiting people for physical labor, you're likely to say, I only want people above a certain height. I only want people meeting certain health requirements. And so it's just very hard to know exactly which direction the bias is going to go. But again, it confirms this idea that there really is this systematic tendency that England is tall compared to all of these Asian societies. And that Indians just tend to be relatively short in this period. And that's an average height of something like 63, 64 inches. And so people are very short, these guys who are moving out there. Okay? And then what other group can we compare in this period? Well, we also have evidence for Africa. And this is for Africa around about 1830. And heights here are 163 to 167 centimeters. And so, again, African heights are a bit lower, these ones measured here, than in Britain, but actually are tending to be higher than those measured in Asia. And so it really seems like Africa, even though in technological terms, in other terms, it's far behind Asia in this period, the evidence is that living standards are not particularly low in Africa. And in fact, that they're intermediate between those of Asia and those of Europe in this period. How do we get the evidence for Africa? Well, what had happened by this period was the British had banned slavery. And so the British Navy, there were still attempts to ship slaves across the Atlantic to places like Brazil. The British Navy had patrols to interdict these slave ships. And so when they captured these slave ships and found slaves on them, they would return them to ports in Africa, but for whatever reason, they would actually measure the people and list them and list their heights as well. And so then we get records. So again, there's this whole selectivity issue. These were people who were captured somewhere in Africa and then shipped out on slave ships. So did people who were shorter tend to be more likely to get captured? Again, it's likely to be people at the lower end of the income distribution who end up in this position, being shipped onto slave ships. But on the other hand, since it's costly to ship people across the Atlantic, you're not going to take people who are really weak or who are really short because there's limited space on these ships, and so you want the healthier individuals. But the interesting impression from this heights of the living in this period is that it really confirms the wage data that, and because I haven't mentioned here, but we have other measures from Europe, and they're very similar to those for England. Okay? So there are other parts of North Europe, Scandinavia, Netherlands, have heights that are very similar to England. There are parts of Southern Europe where people are poorer, where the heights are lower. But it really confirms the wage evidence that Europe is relatively rich. Asia is a poor part of the world, all of Asia. And this actually adds then India as well. And that Africa, surprisingly, is relatively kind of rich in terms of these heights measures. So that's the heights of the living. How does that compare to modern hunter-gatherer societies? Because the other thing the anthropologists have done is carefully measure the heights of hunter-gatherers all across the world. And for hunter-gatherers, what's the median height? And the answer is 165 centimeters. And as I say, it's slightly lower than in England, but significantly above heights in places like Asia and equivalent to heights in Africa that were measured in the 19th century. And so it actually fits together reasonably well that living standards amongst hunter-gatherers, and as I say, this measure of heights is both a measure of food consumption, but also of kind of the disease environment that people are exposed to. And the interesting thing here is that hunter-gatherers don't seem to be any worse off. And in fact, they're better off than a lot of the world by 1800. And that varies quite a lot across different hunter-gatherer groups. So some of these first measures were made by anthropologists in the late 19th century and include the Great Plains Indians, for example. And they actually come out at being 172 centimeters on average, the Sioux. And so the interesting thing is that when the English were entering America, there are some Indian groups in America who would be taller than the English settlers. Right? And so under the right conditions in these hunter-gatherer societies, with the right kind of environment, you could actually have groups that were physically quite tall and doing very well nutritionally. There are some hunter-gatherer groups that come in with an average height of 155 centimeters, which says that they're even shorter than the Japanese were in the 19th century. But it just emphasizing this idea that within this Malthusian world, you can get conditions when people live very well and the conditions when people live quite poorly. So that's the heights of the living. If we want to go into the distant past, then you have to turn to skeletons. Right? Now, here we're aided by the fact that there's a lot of interest in what people's heights are as inferred from their skeletons by forensic scientists. Because a lot of times you find bits of a body, and then you've got to actually infer, well, what height was that person when they were alive? And so it's possible using the leg bones of bodies to actually infer heights, and detailed and controlled studies have been done where they've actually taken people who are alive, measured their heights, and then later got their skeletons and actually then said, well, what's the correlation between the leg length and the height of the person when they were actually living, right? And so there are a number of different measures that are used. As I say, that's an interest to anthropologists. It's also an interest to forensic scientists. And so we have all of these pieces of evidence. Now, the next thing that helps us is that Europeans have a pretty casual attitude towards the dead in some ways. And so there's not been a lot of resistance to actually just going and measuring all these bodies, digging up bodies. As I say, it's a society that doesn't have, in some sense, a lot of reverence for the dead. And in fact, there are churches, for example, there's a famous church in Czechoslovakia where there's a crypt that's decorated with skeletal parts. Right? And you can go on the web, I should find the link to that, and you'll see that they have hundreds of skeletons and bits of skeletons that they've used actually to decorate the crypt of this church. Or there are churches in Italy where they have in cases the skeletons of various saints that from the past. And so it turns out that Europe has a nice collection of skeletal evidence, and also there are excavations that are done where, of graveyards, medieval graveyards, earlier graveyards, where you can actually come up with bodies. Now, there's one problem with skeletons, though, which is the chance of a skeleton surviving is dependent on how robust the person was. And the way that shows up is that if you get these collections of graveyards, what you'd expect, knowing roughly what life expectancy is, you'd expect a certain proportion of children versus adults and a certain proportion of women versus men. Okay? And what they could do then is that you think they could take this, because you could measure the age of people from skeletons up until they get to adulthood reasonably well, that you could actually use this skeletal evidence to estimate directly for these early populations what was life expectancy. Right? Just by looking at the distribution of people's ages of death. Or if you just knew how many people died under age 15, it would actually give you a fairly good estimate of life expectancy. The problem is, though, looking at this archaeological evidence, is there's not enough young people in these collections, right? And there's too few women in these collections. And so one of the problems is that the chances of these things surviving clearly depend on the age and robustness of the individual. And so the difficulty with this evidence is going to be, I think there's going to be a bias in terms of finding that people in the past were bigger, simply because really short individuals might not actually survive under the ground. I mean, it's only under certain conditions that the bones will actually survive intact and not degrade and become like the surrounding material. But for what it's worth, here's the evidence for Europe. And so Europe, and first of all, we have the evidence from the Mesolithic. So the Mesolithic is the Middle Stone Age in Europe, okay, which is, in different parts of the world, the timing of the Stone Age differs. but this is going to be 4,000 or 5,000 years ago in Europe, okay, Middle Stone Age. The average height of male skeletons from that, excavated from that period, is about 168 centimeters. So remember, for England, it was 166 to 171 for the living, right? We can also, for England, though, it turns out there have been excavations of people buried around about 1800, so we can directly compare skeletons to skeletons. And so for England, around about 1800, those excavations gave an average height of 170 centimeters. And so the evidence then from Europe is that if we go back to the Mesolithic, heights are pretty similar to those of skeletal remains. And that was England in 1800. In Norway in 1800, skeletal collection there was 165 centimeters. In Holland, it was 167 centimeters. And so the idea is that for Europe around 1800, male skeletons are averaging about 167, 168 centimeters. It's the same height as the Mesolithic, right? And then we also have evidence from the Neolithic, which is the New Stone Age. And that is 167 to 173 centimeters. And again, that average is going to be about 170. Okay? And so, as I say, the evidence from these skeletal remains, with that caveat about survival rates of skeletons, is that there's no progress in Europe in terms of human heights all the way from 3000 BC, 4000 BC, up till 1800. Okay? And that Europeans in the Stone Age really are quite tall compared to most people around the world in 1800. I don't have time to finish all of this now, but when I come back, it turns out we also have evidence for Japan back to 300 BC and for Polynesia in the pre-contact period. And the systematic evidence is of no upwards trend in human heights in this pre-industrial period. Okay, see you on Wednesday.